So this is where I first started dyeing fabric. Kitchen table, no kidding, in between batches of diapers. And all I knew how to do was was batik. And batik has its limits because you over dye every color. Unless you paint the wax in lines, you can put lines of wax and you control the dye and make it stop flowing. Here's another example. Trying to paint in shading. And I learned the following year, I took a one-day workshop from a couple, Duncan Slade and Gail Frost from Massachusetts. In that one-day workshop, they taught us how to thicken the dye. And then I was able to do this. My story here is that this entire quilt is a whole cloth out to the binding. And when after I washed it, it wasn't this color. All of the blue-green was yellow-green because I was using turquoise as a primary color, blue. And the turquoise isn't really, you really can't do precision color mixing with turquoise because it's a large molecule, doesn't bond at the same speed as the others. So I literally sat down and painted blue over the entire quilt again where I wanted more blue. And I stopped using turquoise as my mixing color. I mean, I use it, but I don't use it for precision color mixing. Okay, so now I got my first studio. You see here one of the walls where I'm stashing my fabric, and my ironing board is portable, and my little Formica table. And if you turn your head, you see the other wall. The room was 12 feet wide, and we put a sink in it. My neighbor was remodeling his kitchen, and we took his sink and cabinet, or bought it from him, and put it in here. Everything in the room is movable, is my answer to what to do with a small room. This bookshelf was out in the hallway not too long after this picture. And I'm doing my fabric dyeing on this table, monoprinting. And then another key to working in a small space, if this piece of cotton is taped to a firm white board, it's like a masonite, but has one white side, I can pick the board up and I can put it over and leave it on the wall. I can take it out in the hallway. I can put it somewhere else. I know that I wanted it to be stretched and firm, so this is a loose piece of fabric. It's got the soda on it. I partly dyed it, and it's dry, so I just draped it over the edge. And here's another piece that was in progress. It's a piece of silk that has the soda on it, and I'm not done painting it. It's hanging on the wall. So you can rotate things. Okay, this is the sink, and this is the bucket situation. You can dye a yard of fabric in here, but I was really still doing this painting. See my swatches? I painted these to see what colors I wanted for a quilt I was working on. And here's the quilt, emphasizing again that this is a whole cloth quilt. This edge is painted. The dye stops here. It's painted with dye. And this piece of silk where I'm quilting feels exactly the same as this piece of silk. And one of the things about silk is it has a reflectivity. It shows off your texture of your quilting and so on. And I'm able to stitch through it and still get the glow from the silk. Here I've got a movable ironing board. I've got a movable cutting board. My sewing machine is moved over to the table. So I was just starting to learn how to machine quilt here. And this little, it's a plexiglass with a pattern on it of a Baltimore album quilt. And, you know, I was going back and forth, big and small. You see the ruler up here? After it's stretched and dyed and washed, then I quilted it. And it took me longer to quilt it than it did to paint it. Anyway, I ran out of steam on those. This is the one where my last bathtub batch. The whole border, this quilt was big, the border was big, And I wanted it to be smooth, black. And I literally had it to have such a big piece of fabric, I had to put it in the bathtub. And that was the last time I ever did bucket dyeing. After that, it became obvious that the fabric I really liked was in the bottom of the bucket and never got stirred. And that's how I decided to start doing low water immersion dyeing, is just use less water, use less dye, and use no salt. Anyway, much easier. Here is after all of these gradations of cream and of red and of blue were enabled because I could do low water immersion dyeing. Also, I was outgrowing my studio. This is taller than the wall in my studio then. I was doing a lot of monoprinting, and I loved some of this fabric, and it took me years before I would cut it up. But I finally cut up this black and white piece and pieced it together. Then I quilted it, and after I quilted it, I painted it with more dye. See these areas that are red? I painted on the thickened dye, and then I washed the quilt again. So just because the quilt is quilted doesn't mean you're done dyeing it. I had quite a few pieces that I did something like that too. Here I have to move my sewing machine to get into the wall because I can't see the quilt. But all of this is printed and painted. The water is monoprinted, and the rollers and the immersion dyeing combination all in one quilt. But I did move. I did get my big studio. I'm really pleased. I got to plan it myself, and I got to work big. That was my goal. I don't always work big, but it's nice to be able to. And I have a 12-foot wall behind me. And I was making wedding quilts. This is one of my nieces who got married. And all of the fabric in this is folded and in low water immersion dyed. And I'm starting to learn to use a long arm here. And again, a combination of low water immersion dyed and printed and painted with dye. And this green is darker at the bottom and lighter at the top because I had it in a long box, and I put more dye in one end and less dye in the other end. Here's my message to all of you. How can I work without making a mess? Well, I don't know what a mess is. This is artwork, not a mess. And by the way, my grandchildren have dyed fabric, but this is not dye. This is washable, non-toxic paints. And some people, everybody has a different style, right? She's got a plan here. And other people, they have a different way of working. You know, they're having a good time. And I see in my classes, I see it all. Everybody has a different level, what they want to do, what they, have the energy to do, and how neat they want it to be. So the way I control the dye in most cases is I mix it with this thickener. Here I've got the thickener and pouring it out of the container. You can see how thick it is, and it's going into the dye concentrate. And it's approximately half dye and half thick print paste will make a very nice, dark, controllable color. And this is almost too thick. I might put some more dye in that. If you put in too much print paste, you'll have light blue, right? Anyway, another thing I hear is that, let's see, I can't dye fabric. I have to wait till summer. Well, here I'm in the Rocky Mountains. It's snowing outside. One time I was in Buffalo, and we had a classroom, and it had windows on 3 sides, and it was a blizzard. You could see the snow going around in circles. You don't need to be outside. You just need to know where to put the dye. Obviously, not everybody has a sink sitting right behind them working here. This is in Switzerland. I was teaching in this classroom for 2 weeks. And where do you think the sink is? Yep, downstairs. And we got a lot of fabric dyed. Nobody complained because we were just happy to be able to get it done at all. I think this is a class in Portland. And one of my ways of working, I've already mentioned, is to work on a board where I can take the fabric down, I can pick the board up and move it. And you could dye a lot of stuff on a 20-inch board. Rollers, firm foam rollers. They used to be, well, they didn't used to be at all, but more people painting at home, I guess, or something, but they are very washable and they're very versatile and they carry the dye really nicely. I use a white shower curtain when I need to, or white vinyl. This was in an art gallery in an old building in Spain, and they really did not want dye on the walls. But it wasn't a problem. We just were careful. Sponges are anything you can squeeze out and wash with water, you clean them quite easily. You can work in a small space, do a lot of repeat printing. You can cut your own foam and make stamps out of it. And you put the dye on with really fine little pointed bottles. In fact, everyone says they can't do it as soon as they squeeze that black bottle, and 5 minutes later, they're experts. I mean, it doesn't take that much practice to get control of, if you want it. Here is somebody she absolutely wanted more gray in that area. So the whole thing was sponge prints, and she came up with her brush and touched it up to be exactly how she wanted it. And by the way, see this tray? That's where her gray is mixed. It's yellow tray, hard to tell. More foam rollers. You can cut your own stencils. You can design them and have a machine cut them. This is what this lady did. Really a lot of potential there. And here's an example of someone in that Swiss classroom. She has used thick dye for the black lines, and she's used real watery dye to fill in the spaces and get pastel colors. You can mix them up on the same piece of fabric at the same time. So I also use silk screens, not too often. They're bulky. You can use a pretty nice small ones that are kind of flat, made out of plastic. And you can cover a lot of fabric with one small silk screen that's easy to wash in the sink. The main thing is this dye doesn't fill up the screen. It doesn't dry and turn to plastic like acrylic paint and fabric paints and so on. You can leave the screen till the next day. The water is still the dye in the screen is still water soluble. That's the same as the brushes and the rollers and everything. So, well, I like this because this is the first week she'd ever dyed fabric. And it's probably that she started on this maybe the third day or something. She had a plan. And one of the things that made it possible to do you see, I've noted is the tables are raised. A lot of you know about that already. But get yourself comfortable. Can you imagine trying to do this outside? Besides that, well, anyway, never mind. So another thing I hear about a lot, I use occasionally, is organza. And you can buy silk organza. This piece, I wanted different values of gray to overlap the parts of the quilt that I was going to put it on. So I mixed a very dark black, and I mixed a lighter value of it and a lighter value of it, and I put it on. The organza was soaked in soda first. So the soda was there to fix it, and I rolled it on with a roller on my table. And then I could cut out the parts I wanted. So just, what if your table isn't big enough? So one of the tricks I learned is that I could take the fabric to the plastic, and then I could pull the plastic to move the fabric so I wouldn't be smearing, because the dye goes through. In many cases, the dye goes through. And I didn't want to have blurred backs and dye leaking through from the front. It doesn't happen quite a lot, because if your dye, like in this little tray here, is thick enough and you don't just sog it on, you can move it around pretty well. So this is a first layer of dye on this piece of fabric that was going to be another wedding quilt. Here's the next layer. So you see here in these light lines, I laid down newspaper, and I started with a dark blue, fairly dark blue at the top, and I kept putting down pieces of newspaper to block out some of it, and I gradually started making the dye darker and darker. So it was somewhat of a gradation from the top to the bottom of the piece. But here's what I want you to know. That you're looking at is wet, very dark blue. You can hardly see through it. This is what the fabric looked like after I washed it. And this is what I expected, because before I washed it, I could see it when it was dry. See, so after it's cured overnight, I covered it lightly with plastic, and then I was gonna look at it. I take the plastic off, I let it dry completely, and then I see what I'm gonna get. And if I could tear a piece of it off, and they should match, dry and washed. If it doesn't, again, I would say to myself, well, maybe my room wasn't warm enough. So low water immersion dyeing. You get a tiny little container. Each of these is like it might be the size of an ice cream container. There's a yard of fabric in each of these. You've seen these pictures. Each of these shoe boxes has a yard of fabric in it. And by the way, you see the colors here. I am using more than red, yellow, and blue, but I'm using more than one yellow, more than one red, and more than one blue. But I'm not buying purple. Well, actually, now there's a single chemical violet and a boysenberry, but I am not buying green or all the other mixes, or anymore, even black, because you can mix them yourself. This is the lesson I mentioned earlier, where you put all the pieces of fabric in one container. These I always put in some of my fabrics as control, so we know what it should have come out like. And these are 3 different kinds of cotton here, and this is what I expect. Different weaves, different qualities, different brands of cotton. I do expect slight variation in them. This one is a little bit darker, I think, because it's a sateen and it's reflexive. It reflects more light to your eyes. This one, however, is a piece of silk. It's redder, which I expect. Silk does not dye the same as cotton in a low water immersion dye bath. And this is a piece of organza. And it's also, after a while, I figured out, whoa, how come the organza is so dark? Well, it's a saracen on it. It's a protein that just sucks up the dye. Anyway, more about that later. So I guess I should actually say that you need to have some cotton that you know dyes well, and if you're experimenting with some unknown fabrics, you put a piece of what you know in a bucket with the one you're trying out, and you dye them at the same time, identical conditions, and then you wash them and you see if there's any difference. That is the best test for you to find out if you're dyeing good fabric. So I'm going to sound like a broken record, I know, but this is a dye bath with 2 yards of fabric in it. And they're slightly different. One of them is pinched tight, more tightly than the other. And why does the water look green? The water looks green because some of the yellow has already fixed on the fabric, but some of the blue and yellow are still in the water. The blue is a little slower to fix. So you will see, it's shocking. And the fabric had no green in it. It's just that's why you wait an hour, because some of the colors take longer to dye. And they will come out completely different results because of all the different pinching of the clothespins. Now here's a table in the classroom I had. We worked for a week and she just dyed a lot of fabric. Almost all of them were fat quarters. You see all the variations. She's got 2 colors in here. She's got different colors that are related to each other. Here she's got a piece out flat. Unfortunately, it's on a piece of green plastic, so it's hard to tell. But she's got light values and dark values of the same color. Here's a silk scarf that was wetted in soda, and then the dye is applied with this spoon. I mixed some colors in a little muffin palette and spoon it on. Oh, and you know already right now it's much darker now than it will be when it's dry. Okay. Everything looks darker when it's wet. I put almost here because maybe there's some things that doesn't work for. But I took these swatches of gradation. I call it my peach gradation. But I dunked one end of it into water. And this part is still dry. This is when you take the fabric out of the basin and you put it in the washing machine, you never see what value it is. You never actually know unless you were to let it dry. And still you would have a little bit of excess dye maybe sitting on the fabric. So here I am in my studio, and this is using the whole room, and I didn't want dye on the walls, so I put plastic on the wall. Okay, that's one lesson here. Clear white, you can buy marine vinyl. It's very heavy. It's very washable. In fact, when it gets really messy, I can put it in the washing machine. But I like things to be looking like this table, basically. See, all this work is being clamped. There's a rope, and there's lots of stuff going on, and there's no dye anywhere. Okay, and this I realized after I picked out this slide, this is one of my class samples. I drag it with me everywhere I go. The left-hand side is cotton, and the right-hand side is silk, and there's a seam going down the middle. Okay, these are the single chemical colors that are available at this point. And I expect them to be, when I paint with thickened dye, I expect them to be exactly the same. I mean, actually, if you look right up close, you would see slight differences. The silk is a little yellowish, in fact, so anyway. Here is a 9-yard piece of cotton sateen. It is, it's actually 3 yards of 120-inch wide cotton sateen. And I folded it all into this approximately 18-inch container. And this is what you see. I let it sit there a while. Now, can you pick out which piece of fabric that was? I was going to make a blue quilt, and I needed to look at all my blues that day. And here it is right here. You can see the fold marks. And this is a close-up of 4 or 5 pieces of silk organza from which the Saracen has been selectively removed. The protein that's on the outside of silk fibers when we buy it. When organza, when it's stiff, you can feel it, that stiffness. When you remove the Saracen, it becomes very soft and flimsy, and it also dyes lighter color. So this piece of fabric here, I selectively removed the Saracen with a paintbrush, thickened dye and soda ash basically, and washed it all out. And then all of this darker area was still stiff like normal organza, and then I immersion dyed it. And this is the reverse. I clamped these areas with plexiglass, and I held the Saracen there and removed it from the rest of the piece. So it came out very thin, soft, and light colored silk. Anyway, it's fun. Realizing all of you that you can even do this in the dark. This is a workshop I taught in upstate New York, and the lights went out. Well, we're a whole entire day without lights.